At my wedding, my father-in-law gave a toast, then pulled my husband aside and told him, "A little slap helps." Roy ran every room he walked into. At our wedding, he gave a toast about family and loyalty, and everyone clapped for him. And then he put his arm around Danny, my husband, and walked him over to the bar. I was close enough to hear every word. Roy told Danny that a marriage is simple if you start it the right way. He said a little slap helps. He said it keeps a woman honest, that a man should use one early so she learns who is in charge. He said his own father taught him that. Danny said, "Okay, Dad," and walked us away because it was our wedding and nobody wanted a scene. I told myself it was just an old man talking. I found out fast that Roy meant every word of it. Roy and his wife Maureen lived an hour from us, and he liked to drive over without calling. He would walk in our front door and sit at the table and wait to be fed. Maureen always came in behind him carrying his coat and his thermos because Roy did not carry his own things. He snapped his fingers when his coffee was empty, and she got up and filled it without being asked. She had been doing that for 40 years. At dinner, Roy corrected how I cooked, how I folded, how I spoke. He told me a wife serves her husband's plate first and her own last, and that Maureen had never once eaten before him in 40 years, and that was why their marriage worked. Maureen nodded along when he said it. She always nodded. If Roy raised his voice even a little, Maureen went quiet and moved faster. She had a way of watching his hands that I did not understand at first. Then I understood it. Roy never hit anyone in front of us because Maureen had already learned, a long time ago, exactly what Roy was telling Danny to teach me at our wedding. The part that made me sick was how proud Roy was of it. He kept checking on it. He would ask Danny if I was behaving, if I had learned my place. Roy started calling Danny soft, weak, and embarrassment as a man. He said it in front of Maureen and in front of me. The dinner that changed everything was Maureen's own birthday. She had cooked her own birthday meal because Roy did not cook, and she brought the roast out a few minutes late. Roy stood up and started yelling at her in front of all of us about how she could not get one meal on the table on time. He grabbed the dish out of her hands and slammed it down and pulled his hand back like he was going to swing. And Maureen put her arms up over her face the way someone does when it has happened to them many times before. Danny was out of his chair in a second. He got between his father and his mother and told Roy that if he ever raised a hand to anyone again, he would never see either of us again. Roy said it was his house and his wife and his business. Maureen was standing behind Danny with her arms still up, and then she put her arms down. She looked at Danny standing in front of her, a grown man who had never once raised his hand to his own wife, who got up to help clear the table, who said thank you when she cooked. She looked at him like she was seeing something she did not know existed. Maureen set down the towel she was holding. She walked to the closet and got her coat. Roy told her to sit back down, that she was being ridiculous and would not last a week without him. Maureen opened the front door and walked out to her car while he was still talking. She drove to her sister Carol's house an hour away. Roy stood in his doorway sure she would be back by morning, because in 40 years she had never once not come back. She did not come back. A week went by. Roy did not know how to work his own washing machine. He did not know what Maureen did all day because he had never once paid attention. He ran out of clean clothes and clean dishes. So he got in his car and drove to our house and walked in without knocking, the way he always did. Sat down at our table and told Danny to call his mother and make her come home. He said none of this would have happened if Danny had kept his own wife in line like a man. He said it was Danny's fault that Maureen got ideas. Then he asked me what was for dinner. I stood up from the table. I did not raise my voice. I looked at Roy and said there was no dinner for him, that he did not get to show up at my house without calling and sit at my table and tell me what to cook. Roy laughed the kind of laugh a person does when they think you are being cute. He looked at Danny and asked if he was going to let his wife talk to him like that. Danny pushed his chair back and stood up right next to me, shoulder to shoulder, and said she was talking to him like that because she was right. Roy's face changed. The laugh was gone. He went from the man who runs the room to something smaller, almost instantly. He rubbed his face and let out a long breath and said he was just an old man who missed his wife and did not know where she kept the coffee filters. His voice cracked on the last part. For a second, just a second, I almost felt bad for him. Danny sat back down and put his hands on the table and looked at his father the way you look at someone you are really trying to understand. He said, "Dad, do you understand why Mom left?" Roy nodded slowly and said he pushed too hard sometimes. Danny waited a beat. Then he said, "You hit her." Everything changed in that second. Roy slammed his hand on the table so hard the salt shaker jumped and said he never once hit that woman hard enough to leave a mark, and she knew it. I watched Danny's face go completely still. Not angry, not sad, just still. Because Roy did not say he never hit her. He said he never hit her hard enough. He thought that was a defense. He thought that made it okay. Danny looked at his father and something closed behind his eyes like a door shutting. He said, "You need to leave." Roy leaned back and crossed his arms and said he was not going anywhere until someone called Maureen and told her to come home. So I walked to the counter and picked up the phone and dialed Carol's house. Roy sat up a little straighter because he thought this was going to go his way. He thought Maureen would hear that he had driven all this way and she would fold the way she always folded. Carol picked up and a few seconds later Maureen's voice came on the line, quiet and careful the way it always was. I said, "Maureen, Roy is at our house right now and he wants you to come home. Do you want to come home?" I asked it plain, no pressure either way, just a question that maybe nobody had ever asked her before. Maureen said no. One word, steady, no shaking in it, just no. I put the phone on speaker and set it on the table between us. Maureen's voice came through clear enough for everyone. She said, "Roy, I am not coming back." Roy started talking before she finished the sentence, telling her she was confused, that Carol was filling her head with nonsense, that she needed to come home and they could talk like adults. Maureen let him finish. Then she said she had packed a bag on her birthday. She said that bag was in the trunk of her car for 3 weeks before she used it. She drove to the grocery store with it behind the spare tire. She went to church with it. She cooked his dinners and washed his clothes, and that bag was sitting in the trunk the whole time. She said this was not Carol's idea. This was hers. Roy went quiet. His mouth was open a little. He stared at the phone like it had said something in a language he did not speak. The call ended. Roy stood up slowly from the chair and looked right at me and pointed his finger and said, "I did this. That I gave her the idea that she could leave. That 40 years, and she never once thought about it until I came along." I did not say anything back. I just held his look. Danny stepped forward and said, "Get out of my house, Dad. Now." Roy dropped his hand. He walked to the front door and opened it, and I thought he was going to leave, but he stopped in the doorway and turned around one more time. His face was calm in a way that did not match anything that had just happened. He said, "I will fix this myself then." He pulled the door shut, and a few seconds later I heard his car start. I called Maureen back and told her what Roy said when he walked out. She went quiet. Not the kind of quiet where someone is thinking, but the kind where someone already knows what comes next. She knew what that meant better than any of us. Danny and I drove to Carol's house the next morning. When Maureen opened the door, she looked different, rested. The tight look around her eyes was softer, like something had let go in her sleep. She was wearing a blue sweater I had never seen before, something she had picked out herself, not the plain brown and gray things Roy always said were practical enough. Her hair was down instead of pulled back the way Roy liked checked it. There was already coffee made, and Maureen had a cup half finished in front of her own chair. She had poured herself coffee first, before guests, before anyone. 40 years she had served Roy his coffee before she even thought about her own. That half-empty cup told me more about what Roy had done to her than anything else I had seen. Maureen told us things we had never been told. She said Roy hit her for the first time 6 months after their wedding. She was 23. She drove to her mother's house the next day and told her what happened, and her mother said all husbands get angry sometimes. She stayed because Roy controlled everything. The money, the car, every bill, every account. She did not even have her own bank account until Carol helped her open one in secret 3 years ago. Carol had been helping her save small amounts for 3 years. Grocery money stretched, change from errands, enough now for a deposit on an apartment. Roy was so sure she would never leave, he never thought to look. Danny asked why she did not tell him sooner. Maureen put her hand on top of his and said, because he was a boy and then a young man, and she did not want him to do something that would make his father hurt him too. She said watching Danny stand between her and Roy on her birthday was the first time in 40 years that someone had stood up for her. Maureen said she needed to go back to the house once. Her birth certificate and social security card from the filing cabinet. Her mother's ring from a locked desk drawer Roy controlled because he said jewelry that valuable should not be left where a woman could lose it. A box of photographs from the bedroom closet. Roy had told her once that if she ever left, he would burn everything she cared about. Carol said Roy never missed his Monday morning routine. The same place every week for 15 years, 9 to noon. But before we could move, Roy called with a dinner invitation for Monday night. Everyone come to his house. He wanted to apologize properly. Danny said with his father, there was no such thing as a coincidence. We shifted to Sunday morning. Roy never missed church, especially now when the whole town could see him sitting in the pew looking like a good man who missed his wife. Carol had a spare key Maureen gave her that Roy did not know about. We pulled onto Roy's street and the driveway was empty. Carol unlocked the front door and we went in. The house already smelled different without Maureen in it. Dishes stacked in the sink, trash spilling over, coffee rings on every surface. Danny went straight for the filing cabinet. I went to the bedroom for the photographs. Carol went to the desk for the ring. Danny found the filing cabinet unlocked and pulled Maureen's documents. Then he stopped. He pulled out a folder with Maureen's name on it in Roy's handwriting. He sat down in the desk chair like his legs stopped holding him. I walked over and he handed me the folder. Inside were medical records from a clinic visit 22 years ago. Maureen came in with a fractured wrist. The doctor wrote that the patient reported falling on the porch steps. There was a diagram of the break. Danny said he was 10 years old when it happened, that he remembered her in a cast for 6 weeks, that she told him she slipped on the porch. He sat there holding the paper with his mother's lie written in a doctor's handwriting, the lie kept by Roy in a locked cabinet for 2 decades like a receipt. Carol called from the living room. She had the ring and something else, a stack of handwritten letters in Maureen's writing, all held together with a rubber band. Carol pulled the band off and started reading, and her face crumpled. She handed me one, undated. It said, today was bad, I am still here. She handed me another. It said, Danny smiled at me today, and it was worth another week. I put every letter in the bag. Then I heard a car door slam outside. I ran to the window and looked through the curtain. It was Clinton, Roy's cousin, walking up the driveway with a casserole dish. I ran to the living room and said Clinton is outside. Danny said back door, now. Carol and I went out through the kitchen and around the side of the house to the car. I heard the front door open, Danny moving to it before Clinton could even knock. Danny's voice came through calm as water, telling Clinton he was just grabbing a few of his mother's things that Roy had asked him to. Clinton said Roy told him nobody was supposed to be here. Danny said you know how dad is. Clinton left the casserole. Danny came around the side of the house with the bag and we drove away. Roy had been working the phone since Maureen left, calling relatives to say she was having a breakdown, and Carol was keeping her from getting help, telling them I was destroying his family. He found Dana's number, my closest friend, a woman he had never met, and called her to say I was the problem. Roy was not trying to get Maureen back anymore. He was making sure everyone who left him paid for it. Danny called every relative Roy had reached and told each one what Roy said at our wedding. Most went quiet. Clinton said Roy was a good man, and Maureen was dramatic, and every marriage had rough patches. Maureen's brother was the only one who asked to see the medical records. When Carol sent him the photo, he did not call back for 2 hours. Danny said Roy was winning not because he had the truth, but because he had the volume. I told him we were done calling people one at a time. We would give Roy his Monday dinner, but at our table on our terms, not to convince him. Roy would never be convinced of anything. We were doing it so Maureen could say what she needed to say to his face, and so Roy could hear all of it at once in a room where nobody was afraid of him. Monday night, I set 5 chairs at the table, medical records in a folder on the counter. Maureen brought her letters in her purse. Danny had screenshots of every text Roy sent. Carol arrived first with Maureen. At 7 o'clock, Roy's car pulled into the driveway. He walked to the front door without knocking, the way he always did, stepped inside, stopped for just a second when he saw all of us, then straightened up and said, good, you all came to your senses. He pulled out the empty chair and sat down across from Maureen, folded his hands on the table and said, let us talk about how we fix this. Nobody moved. Danny reached to the counter, pulled the folder, and slid the medical records across the table until they were right in front of Roy. He said, Mom went to the clinic 22 years ago with a fractured wrist and you told me she fell on the porch. Roy glanced at the paper the way you glance at junk mail and said she did fall. And that was when Maureen spoke for the first time since Roy walked in. Her voice was quiet, but it was not shaking. She said, you pushed me into the counter and I caught myself wrong and I drove myself to the clinic with one hand. She said it the way someone says something they have been holding in their mouth for 22 years, carefully, like the words had edges. Roy waved his hand at the paper like brushing away a fly and said that was 22 years ago and they were talking about now. Danny said they were talking about all of it. I placed my phone face up on the table and read back every text Roy sent to relatives, the lies relayed to us from his phone calls, the different versions of the same story told to 12 people in 6 days. Then I told him about Dana. I looked right at Roy and said, you called my friend Dana, a woman who has never met you. You found her number and called her and told her I was the problem. Roy said he was worried about his wife and a man had a right to be worried. Carol leaned forward and said he was not worried. He was campaigning. 12 people in 6 days with a different version of the same lie to every one of them. Roy turned and looked at Carol and said this had nothing to do with her. Carol said it had everything to do with her, and she had watched him do this to her sister for 40 years, and she was done watching. Roy turned away from Carol like she had not spoken, the way he always handled women who talked back, pretending they did not exist. But Maureen was reaching into her pocket. She pulled out a folded letter, unfolded it slowly, smoothed it flat on the table, and read it out loud. She said, today he told me I was lucky he kept me. He said no one else would want me. I made pot roast, and he threw it on the floor because it was dry. I cleaned it up and made another one. Danny was at school. I cried in the shower so no one would hear. The room was so quiet I could hear the clock on the wall. Roy looked at the letter and said, was she going to sit there and read her diary like a child. Maureen pulled out a second letter and read that one too. She said he pulled her hair so hard a piece came out and she put it in an envelope in case she ever needed proof, and the envelope was in Carol's safe. Roy pushed his chair back and stood up and said he came here for a conversation and was being ambushed by women who did not understand what a marriage takes. Danny stood up on the other side of the table, slowly, no raised voice, no step toward his father, and said, "Sit down, Dad." Roy stayed standing with his chest out and his chin up. He looked at Danny and said, "And I was right. Look at your mother. 40 years, and she never wanted for anything." Danny's voice came out steady and clear, and it was the saddest thing I had ever heard, because it was a son telling his father the truth and knowing his father would never hear it. He said, "She wanted to not be hit. She wanted to eat before her food was cold. She wanted to sleep without being afraid. She wanted to pour her own coffee first. She wanted for everything. Dad, you just never let her say it." Roy's mouth opened and nothing came out. For a few seconds he stood there with his eyes moving, and then his face crumbled, but it did not crumble into sadness. It crumbled into rage, his hands shaking, the veins in his neck standing out, and he said, "After everything I gave this family, after everything I built, you are all going to sit here and tell me I was the problem." Nobody answered him. Not me, not Danny, not Carol, not Maureen. The silence sat on that table heavier than anything Roy had ever slammed on it. It filled the room and pressed against him from every side. There was no one to yell over, no one to cut off, no place to redirect, just the quiet and the sound of his own breathing. Roy looked at Maureen and his voice went lower, softer, the voice he used when he switched from anger to need, the voice that had probably pulled Maureen back 100 times over 40 years. He said, "Maureen, come home. We can work this out." Maureen looked at him. She really looked at him. She studied his face the way you study something you are about to put down for the last time. And then she said, "No, Roy, I am not coming home. I have an apartment. Carol helped me find it. I am moving in on Saturday, and the lawyer I hired will contact you about dividing what is ours." Roy blinked. He said, "Lawyer." Maureen said she used the money from the account Carol helped her open 3 years ago, that he did not know about it because he never once asked what she did with her time, that he had assumed she was waiting for him. Roy sat back down like the air left him all at once. His hands went flat on the table the same way Maureen's had been when he walked in. Roy looked at Danny. Danny said, "You are my father and I love you, but I will not let you hurt anyone else. If you want to be in my life, you get real help. Until then, you are not welcome in this house and not welcome around my wife." Roy sat with his hands flat on the table and his eyes wet. The tears did not fall because he had spent his whole life making sure crying was something other people did, and he could not do it even now with everything stripped away. He stood up one more time. He picked up his car keys. He looked at Carol, who did not look away. He looked at me, and I held his eyes without blinking, without giving him anything. He looked at Maureen, and Maureen looked back at him with 40 years of silence behind her eyes. He looked at Danny, and Danny looked back at him like a man who loved his father and had chosen his mother and was going to live with both of those things for the rest of his life. Nobody flinched. Not one person in that room looked away. Roy walked to the door and opened it and stood in the doorway and turned around and looked at all of us one last time and said, "You will all regret this." I said, "No, Roy, you are the only one in this room with regrets. You just have not figured that out yet." Roy stood there one more second. Then he walked out and pulled the door shut behind him. Outside, Roy's car started. The engine turned over and the headlights swept across the living room wall, and then the sound got smaller as he pulled away.